now arrive at the final chapter in the saga of Ned Kelly and his gang. A look at what happened to their remains after the siege at Glenrowan. This episode focuses solely on the aftermath, so we've left out the dramatic events of the siege itself, which were already covered in detail in our previous episodes. If you haven't seen episodes 1 to 4, we strongly recommend watching them first to fully appreciate the complete story of bushranger Edward Kelly and the events that led to this point. The Glenrowan Siege is over, and Jones Inn is ablaze. Amid the chaos and flames, a lone figure steps into the burning building in search of survivors. He was no ordinary man, he was Father Matthew Gibney, who would later become the third Roman Catholic Bishop of Perth in 1886 and serve until 1910. In 1880, while travelling through the colony of Victoria by train from Benalla to Albury, Gibney disembarked at Glenrowan when he learned of the siege. Ned Kelly and his gang had been cornered by police at the Glenrowan Inn, which the police set alight in an attempt to force out the remaining bushrangers. Father Gibney courageously entered the burning structure, hoping to rescue anyone still alive. Inside, he found the lifeless body of Joe Byrne, along with Dan Kelly and Steve Hart, whose bodies were not yet touched by fire. He also discovered a mortally wounded hostage, Martin Cherry, to whom he administered the last rites before helping carry him out. Joe Byrne had clearly been killed by a bullet. But there was something strange about the bodies of Dan Kelly and Steve Hart. They showed no signs of bleeding. Gibney later reflected that the way they lay seemed to convey a message to the police that it was not by their hand the two had died. It is widely believed that Dan and Steve chose to end their own lives, perhaps by poison or other means, rather than be captured. As flames tore through the inn, Gibney finally emerged, refusing to meet his fate in the fire, calling out solemnly, "The men all dead inside." Treating Father Gibney's words as a signal that it was safe from gunfire, Constable James Dwyer, James Arthur, and Harry Armstrong entered the burning building. They managed to retrieve the slightly scorched body of Joe Byrne and haul it outside. But the room where Dan Kelly and Steve Hart lay was already engulfed in flames. Meanwhile, a few others entered the inn and carried out the dying railway plate layer, Martin Cherry, though he would soon succumb to his injuries. The remains of Dan Kelly and Steve Hart were later discovered in the smouldering ruins of the Glenrowan Inn, burned beyond recognition. It was impossible to tell which body belonged to whom, let alone determine the cause of death. A packet of poison found in Joe Byrne's pocket lends weight to the theory that Dan and Steve chose suicide over surrender. All four, the three gang members and Martin Cherry, were taken to the Glenrowan railway station. It is worth noting that the law which had declared the Kelly gang outlaws had expired just 2 days before the deaths of Joe, Dan, and Steve. That act had previously allowed anyone to shoot the gang members on sight without warning. We have already detailed how Ned Kelly was captured at Glenrowan in the 4th episode of the Ned Kelly story, so we won't repeat it here. After his capture, Father Gibney also tended to the wounded Ned Kelly, hearing his confession and administering the last rites. While Ned lay at the Glenrowan railway station, his sisters, Maggie Skillian and Kate Kelly, were permitted to visit him. A request by Dick Hart, brother of Steve Hart, to claim Steve's body for a family burial was denied by the authorities. Until the inquest was completed, the remains were to remain under the control of the Victorian government. At Glenrowan, Superintendent Francis Hare had been wounded, and control had passed to Superintendent Sadlier, who was left with only a few policemen. Police were concerned by the growing crowd of Kelly sympathisers gathering in the area. Aware of the potentially volatile situation, Commissioner Sadlier initially informed the Kelly and Hart families that they had his permission to take the bodies of Dan Kelly and Steve Hart for burial. The families collected the charred remains and first took them to McDonald's Railway Tavern, then to the home of Ned's sister, Maggie Skillian, in Greta. However, Captain Standish soon overruled this decision, declaring that all bodies must be available for the coroner's inquest. Superintendent Sadlier, following orders, conveyed the message to the families. As night fell, Ned Kelly, still gravely injured, was transported to Benalla. The body of Joe Byrne was taken with him. Ned was placed in a lockup, and Byrne's body was kept in an adjoining cell. At the Benalla barracks, the body of Joe Byrne was propped up against a door and displayed for a photographer to capture an image. This haunting scene was photographed by J.W. Lint, and in a rare surviving image, now held in the State Library of Victoria, Arthur Berman can be seen photographing Byrne's corpse. The next day, Ned Kelly was transported by train to Melbourne, lying on a mattress due to his injuries. As the train passed through Darnabrook, Ned pointed to a hill near Beveridge and said to the trooper beside him, "Do you see a little hill there? That is where I was born. Now I am passing through this, I suppose, to my doom." Meanwhile, the charred bodies of Dan Kelly and Steve Hart had been taken to the home of Ned's sister, Maggie Skillian, in Greta. Their coffins were marked. Dan Kelly died the 28th of June, 1880, aged 19. Steve Hart died the 28th of June, 1880, aged 21. Soon, a messenger from Superintendent Sadlier arrived in Greta with a request for the bodies to be returned for a coroner's inquest. The family refused. Emotions ran high, and Kelly sympathizers were outraged at the prospect of the authorities reclaiming the bodies. Plans were made for Senior Constable John Kelly, no relation to Ned, along with 5 troopers, to head to Greta and retrieve the remains by force if necessary. But before any confrontation occurred, common sense prevailed. A magistrate issued a burial certificate, authorizing interment without the need for an inquest. Around this time, Tom Lloyd, Ned Kelly's first cousin and close confidant, arrived in Benalla to request the release of Joe Byrne's body so it could be buried by his family. But the authorities refused. In the days that followed, some newspapers criticized the apparent double standards shown by the police in their handling of the 3 gang members' remains. While Dan Kelly and Steve Hart's bodies were returned to their families, Joe Byrne was denied that dignity. His body was buried in an unmarked grave at the Benalla Cemetery. Back in Melbourne, nearly 4,000 people had gathered at Spencer Street Station, hoping to catch a glimpse of Ned Kelly as he arrived. Fearing a commotion, the authorities quietly removed him from the train at North Melbourne Station instead. Even there, several hundred people had gathered, having anticipated the possibility. When Ned was taken to the Melbourne jail, his mother, Ellen Kelly, was already serving a 3-year sentence in the women's wing for aiding and abetting the attempted murder of Constable Fitzpatrick. With permission from the governor of the jail, John Castillo, who had previously served as governor of Beechworth Jail and was known to both, Ellen was granted the opportunity to see her son. As we mentioned in the previous episode, the Kelly family, with their finances depleted, could only afford to hire 37-year-old Henry Bindon as Ned's barrister. Bindon had only recently been admitted to the bar after struggling for years to pass his legal exams. At the time, he had never appeared before the Supreme Court, nor even participated in a jury trial. The only advantage he offered was his modest fee, just 7 guineas per day. Despite his inexperience, Bindon was not without support. David Gaunson, a Melbourne solicitor and Member of Parliament, had taken an early interest in Ned Kelly's case. Though unpaid, Gaunson did everything he could to prepare Bindon for the enormous task ahead. Gaunson had played a key role in shaping the legal defense strategy that Kelly would use following his capture, and his guidance became crucial in the lead-up to the trial. On the 29th of October, 1880, Judge Sir Redmond Barry delivered the death sentence to Ned Kelly. The trial had gripped the colony, and now, the final verdict was being pronounced in a hushed courtroom. Justice Barry read the sentence as follows. Edward Kelly, the verdict pronounced by the jury is that you are guilty of the charge of willful murder. It is my duty to pass sentence of death upon you, and I would wish to say that I do so, not as a mere matter of form, but as a duty which I am bound to discharge, as a servant of the law, and as the representative of the majesty of the law of the land. I do not desire to harrow your feelings unnecessarily by any further remarks of mine. I am bound to pronounce the sentence which the law prescribes as the penalty for the crime of which you have been convicted. The sentence of the court is that you be taken from the place from whence you came, and thence to the place of execution, and that you be there hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul." From the moment Judge Barry pronounced the sentence, Ned Kelly's status within the prison changed. No longer permitted to wear regular clothing, he was placed in prison uniform. The prison blacksmith riveted irons onto his legs, first wrapping leather pads around his ankles to prevent chafing. Ned was then moved to a more secure cell in the old block. The outer door remained open, and a lamp burned inside day and night. A warden was stationed outside at all times, with the sole task of ensuring Kelly's safety, until the day he would be led to the gallows. According to courtroom transcripts, in response to Judge Barry's final words, Ned reportedly replied, "I will go a little further than that, and say I will see you there when I go." Ned's final wish was to have his photograph taken, something his family and friends could hold onto after he was gone. The official jail photographer, Charles Nettleton, captured the now famous image of Ned, while armed warders stood nearby. One of his last visitors was his mother, Ellen Kelly, still serving her sentence in the women's wing of Melbourne jail. She is believed to have told him, "Mind you, die like a Kelly son." She was followed by his sisters, Kate and Grace, and his younger brother, Jim. Among the final visitors were Jail Governor John Castillo and his 13-year-old son, Godfrey, both of whom had known Ned from earlier years at Beechworth Jail. Despite a petition bearing nearly 60,000 signatures calling for clemency, the Executive Council refused to spare Ned Kelly's life. Before his execution, Ned made a final appeal that his body be returned to his family for burial. This, too, was denied. On the morning of his death, he was visited again by his sisters and several priests. As he was led from his cell, he reportedly walked with a jaunty step, and passing through the governor's garden, remarked, "Oh, what a pretty garden." On the 11th of November, 1880, at Melbourne Jail, Edward Kelly, son of Red and Ellen Kelly, was hanged. He was 25 years old. To truly understand the legend of Edward Kelly, and the divided public opinion surrounding him, it's important to consider how thoughtful and sensible observers of the era responded to his life and death. There was a well-known admonition in Victoria during that time: all accused are innocent, until proved Irish. One of the most striking examples comes from a powerful editorial published in the Age newspaper on Saturday, the 13th of November, 1880, just 2 days after Ned Kelly's execution. While lengthy, it captures the complex mixture of sympathy, resentment, and reflection that surrounded the bushrangers' end. Now that Edward Kelly has paid the last penalty of the law, it may not be amiss to consider whether Melbourne has not witnessed sadder sights during the last few days than even the spectacle of a man deliberately put to death by his fellow creatures. We do not allude now to the partisanship of the trading demagogue bidding for the Irish vote, or to the natural sympathy of the criminal classes with a felon. We can purge ourselves of the time-serving advocate by such stern expression of opinion as shall silence him and his crew for all time to come, and we can leave Little Bourke Street to the police. Unhappily, among the crowds that signed petitions for Kelly, or passed resolutions in his favor, or waited outside the gates while he was dying, there were many hundreds who habitually respect the law, and whose sympathy is as entirely unselfish as it is irrational. We have tried to understand the motives and the process, we cannot call it of thought, but of argument blended with impulse, by which these men have arrived at their conclusions. We have no doubt many Irishmen are unconsciously influenced by that habitual distrust of the law which English misrule fostered in Ireland, and by a perverted clan feeling for a countryman. But putting aside such motives as these, we think we can assume an apologist to state his case somewhat in this way: here, he might argue, is a man who is, so to speak, the outcome of bad laws, deplorable physical circumstances, and strong temptation. He comes of convict blood, he has the Norfolk Island taint, so to speak, about all his surroundings, and he has grown up knowing that those whom he loved most had been steadily at war with society. The state did not educate him, and the officers of the state, with whom he had to deal, were oppressive and hard. He has shown himself capable of natural affection, of courage, of resource, and of a certain capacity for command. Under better circumstances, he might have risen to be the overseer of a cattle station, or an officer of police. Society has left him to spoil, and society now sentences him to death, not because he is irreclaimable, but because he has been costly and a source of terror, and because it would be dangerous and inconvenient to keep him alive. Worse men than he, malignant and subtle, defy the law daily in the less violent forms of crime, and escape punishment. It is not true to represent Kelly as the mere outcome of circumstances. At no given time in our history has society been so hopelessly bad that it was impossible for the unlearned to discern good from evil. This editorial did not excuse Ned Kelly, but it tried to understand him. And in doing so, it reflected the enduring debate about whether he was a cold-blooded killer, or a man shaped and destroyed by a brutal system. That question continues to echo across Australia's history, and is perhaps what makes the story of Ned Kelly so enduring, and so uniquely Australian. After the execution, Ned Kelly's body remained suspended for 30 minutes, as required by law, to ensure death. It was then placed on a handcart and wheeled out the door, across the prison yard, and into the dead house. There, the execution mask was removed, revealing that Kelly's features had not been disfigured. He had died with a calm, almost placid expression, and his eyes remained bright. Waxworks proprietor, Maximilian Kreitmayr, was granted access to the body. He shaved Ned's head and prepared a wax mold to create a death mask. Cast in plaster, the mask was reproduced in multiple copies, including one displayed at Kreitmayr's popular wax museum on Burke Street. Death masks at the time were made in the name of science, and sometimes as a macabre warning to would-be criminals. The now discredited science of phrenology, the study of skull shape to determine personality traits, was often used on the remains of executed criminals. Practitioners believed that each bump, indentation, or contour on the skull could reveal traits such as aggression, deceit, or leadership. But what happened to Kelly's body, after the death mask was created, became the subject of controversy and horror. On the 19th of November, 1880, the Herald reproduced an earlier article from the Bendigo Independent, detailing the grim fate of Ned Kelly's remains. Ned Kelly's body was given over after execution to medical men, and a nice mess, I am told, they made of it. The students particularly went in heavily, taking part of his body, and generally examining every organ. It was a ghastly sight indeed. Hardly ever paralleled. I am told that portions of the corpse are now in really every curiosity cabinet in Melbourne medical men's places. The skull was taken possession of by one gentleman, and it is probable that he may hereafter enlighten us upon the peculiarities of the great criminal's brain. The medical men call these things preparations, and therefore the public can imagine what has become of Kelly's body. As a matter of fact, I know, and indeed, I have seen, a part of the body, although it is supposed that it was consumed in the quicklime, which is thrown into the grave. In May 1881, disturbing reports surfaced claiming that Kelly's body had been illegally dissected by medical students for anatomical study. The rumor sparked widespread public outrage and fears of civil unrest, prompting the prison governor to publicly deny that such an act had occurred. The fate of Ned Kelly's body remains a disturbing footnote in his story, a reminder of how, even in death, he continued to be treated not only as a criminal, but as a curiosity, an object for study, and a symbol of something far greater than just one man's life. Ned Kelly was buried at the Old Melbourne Jail in what was known as the Old Men's Yard. In 1929, the Old Melbourne Jail was closed for demolition. During the works, the remains of executed felons were uncovered and scheduled for reinterment in a mass grave at Pentridge Prison. Among them, workers noticed a grave marked with the initials EK, carved into a stone embedded in the wall, accompanied by the imprint of a broad arrow, a symbol of the penal system. As word of the discovery spread, boys from the nearby Working Men's College scrambled into the site to scavenge bones, competing with workmen for pieces of what was believed to be Ned Kelly's skeleton. Mr. Lee, of the demolition firm Lee and Dunn, claimed possession of what was thought to be Kelly's skull. It was notable for its complete set of upper teeth. The skull was handed over to police and stored at the Victorian Penal Department before being sent to the Australian Institute of Anatomy in Canberra in 1934. There, the first director, orthopaedic surgeon Sir Colin Mackenzie, examined it out of curiosity. In 1943, Argus feature writer Earl Cox described how Mackenzie had shown him the skull. It was a splendid specimen, with a broad, high forehead and a large cubic capacity. Sir Colin remarked that it was about the best-formed human skull he had examined. He expressed the opinion that its owner must have possessed great gifts of leadership. So that, if skulls count for anything, Ned, in another environment, might have been a credit to the country, instead of being our only folk hero. The skull was on public display at the Institute until the mid-1940s. It then went missing, only to be rediscovered in December 1952, during a clean-out of an old safe. From 1972, it was exhibited at the old Melbourne jail, until it was stolen on the 12th of December, 1978. On the 9th of March, 2008, archaeologists announced they had likely located the burial site of Ned Kelly at Pentridge Prison, among the remains of 32 executed felons. The breakthrough sparked renewed interest in identifying Kelly's remains, especially after a skull, known as the Baxter skull, was returned to the authorities in 2009 by Western Australian farmer Thomas Baxter, who believed it to be Kelly's. However, in 2011, the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine conducted extensive testing and confirmed the Baxter skull did not belong to Ned Kelly. Meanwhile, forensic experts managed to identify Kelly's skeleton among the Pentridge remains, using DNA analysis and forensic comparisons to the bullet wounds he sustained at Glenrowan. A DNA sample provided by Lee Olver, a Melbourne school teacher and great-grandson of Ned's sister, confirmed the match. Kelly's skull was still missing, but the surviving occipital bone showed cuts consistent with post-mortem dissection. In 2012, the Victorian government approved the handover of Kelly's bones to his descendants. The family appealed for the return of the missing skull and began preparing for Ned's final burial. On the 20th of January, 2013, more than 132 years after his execution, Ned Kelly's final wish was fulfilled. Following a requiem mass at St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Wangaratta, his remains were buried in consecrated ground at Greta Cemetery, close to his mother Ellen's unmarked grave. His remains were encased in concrete to prevent future looting. In a poetic twist of history, Kelly's original headstone, along with those of other felons executed at the old Melbourne jail, had been repurposed during the Great Depression. The stones were used to build bluestone retaining walls along Melbourne's beaches, to protect against erosion, leaving behind a haunting symbol of justice, loss, and forgotten stories. And here ends our Ned Kelly series. Before we go, let's take a final look at what became of the main players in the Kelly saga. Maggie Skillian, Ned's sister. Divorced and remarried cousin Tom Lloyd. Had 11 children. Died aged 39 in 1896. Kate Kelly, Ned's youngest sister. Married blacksmith William Foster, moved to Forbes, New South Wales. Found drowned in 1898, likely suicide. Ellen Kelly, Ned's mother. Lived to 91. Died on the 27th of March, 1923. Buried at Greta. Raised the children of Maggie and Kate, after their death in their 30s. Superintendent Francis Hare. The officer who once stood face to face with Ned Kelly at Glenrowan, retired from the police force and went on to write a book about his experiences. He lived out his days in Rupertswood Mansion, Sunbury, and died in 1892, aged 61. Constable Thomas McIntyre, the sole police survivor from Stringybark Creek, carried the burden of those events throughout his life. He later became a police magistrate and passed away in 1918. Thomas Curnow, the school teacher who warned the authorities at Glenrowan, moved to Ballarat for safety, lived a quiet life afterward. Though briefly celebrated, he faded into obscurity and died in 1922. Judge Redmond Barry, who sentenced Ned Kelly to death, didn't live long after the trial. In a strange twist of fate, he died of illness just 12 days after Kelly was hanged. Cause: lung congestion and a neck carbuncle. Barrister Henry Bindon represented Ned Kelly. Had a troubled legal career, paralysed in 1891, and died in 1893. Wild Wright continued stealing horses, later joined a circus and boxing troupe. Died in Northern Territory in 1911. Harry Power, the gentleman bushranger who was Ned's mentor. Released in 1885. Worked as a guide on the prison hulk Success. Drowned in the Murray River in 1891. Dan Kelly and Steve Hart. Dan Kelly and Steve Hart perished at Glenrowan, though for years, rumours swirled that they had somehow escaped the fire. Their charred body was beyond recognition. Alexander Fitzpatrick, dismissed from the police in 1880. Died in 1924, aged 68. Sub-Inspector Stanhope O'Connor led the Black Trackers at Glenrowan. Later settled in Melbourne and worked at the Stock Exchange. Assistant Commissioner Charles Nicholson resigned after the Royal Commission, but later promoted to police magistrate. Died in 1898 at South Yarra. Anne Jones, innkeeper at Glenrowan, lost 2 children and her husband. Remarried in 1891 and died in 1910, aged 80. Captain Frederick Standish died the 19th of March, 1883, aged 58, from heart and liver disease.